Well, hello there, Mr. Armstrong. You can tell that I traded in my halo for the crown. So today I'm role playing the king, and you were role playing. Who is that?
Oh, I'm going to be the Pope, which puts me and has gives me more power than you.
Well, that's true. We could talk about Thomas Becket and how we could show that, but that's not today's computer side chat. Today we're going to go into one of the more interesting events during the Middle Ages, and that is the Crusades. You want to talk a little bit about it before we even pull our slideshow up? Maybe we can just briefly reiterate some things, and then we'll pull the slideshow up and move from there.
Well, I think it's really important to make sure that we are in the shoes of our characters in the Middle Ages, right? So it's the religion plays such a vital role in everybody's lives, and it dictates so much of what they do that they are willing to sometimes do things that we wouldn't necessarily think as religious acts in order to help ensure their travel to heaven. Right. So I think that mindset is going to be important for us to understand as we move forward.
I think the kids have a good grasp of that. So I think we're kind of ready. We'll start. Let's pull up the slideshow, the cross and the crescent, the Crusades. So I'll do a little bit here, and you can talk about the two images in the Latin there, but the Crusades is going to be a series of war. We're going to reiterate this again, between two groups of people, the Christians of the mainland Europe, and then, of course, the Muslims represented by the Crescent, who are at this point are occupying the Middle East and Northern Africa. And I guess from there, we'll kind of talk about symbolism, make sure they understand that, and then we'll move forward.
Okay, so the symbolism here is we've got the cross that's going to represent the Christian religion, and then we have the crescent, which is representation of the Islamic religion, and we've got these two funny looking words in between, the Deus Vult, which is Latin for God wills it.
Deus Vult, Deus Vult, Deus Vult, because that's the way the Pope's going to say it. God wills it, God wills it, God wills it.
And with your enthusiasm, we're going to let you continue on, and we'll move on to the next slide.
Well, thank you. That was I appreciate your support of my enthusiasm. So as the next slide pops up, we got to do a little bit of background. And the first thing we're going to talk about, and hopefully everything works as needed, we had this line drawn way back when we were talking about Rome, and Rome kind of split into the eastern and western half. And something we didn't go into a great detail was that the eventually after the fall of Rome, the church kind of splits into what's called the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. That becomes a little bit important here. It's called the Great Schism. We're not going to go into great detail at this moment about it, but you need to keep that in mind. So we are sitting in the middle of the Middle Ages. The year's about 1000, let's say, and you've got constant fighting between the kingdoms of Europe. So I think Mr. Armstrong's going to add a nice little thing to show us that we're fighting like crazy in Europe.
And remember, at this point, we're talking about, we are referencing probably more what's going on the western side of Europe with the fall of the Roman Empire, with that split. And, on the western side of all this is really pretty heavily dominated here. So I'm going to put a lot of these little swords in to represent that. All right.
Yeah. So but the idea is that the Christians are fighting Christians for the most part. They're fighting all over to expand their manners, to make their empire, their kingdoms much larger. If you remember back to our feudalism chat, we talked about how manners looked, and there was a king, and then there were knights, and then nobles, then knights. Well, those would conquer another king. So there's constant battlement. But while those fights are occurring, a lot of Christians are going to somewhere called the Holy Land. And the Holy Land, if you remember back to the beginning of the year, we talked about the Holy Land, and he's circling it, is the area over by where Jerusalem, modern-day Israel, would be today. If you look at that, we're talking about Jerusalem, Beirut, Antioch would be another one that's in there that's going to become important. But those are places that at the current time, Christians were going on pilgrimaging there, specifically to Jerusalem, because that was the area that Christ was alive and walked. So it's a pilgrimage place. But Jerusalem is being controlled by the Islamic faith. They are the ones who surround all this land and control it. For the first parts of the Crusades, Christians were allowed to make pilgrimage, and there didn't seem to be any problem. So the pilgrims would basically just stroll, and stroll. And eventually they'd come and they'd get to Jerusalem, and they would get to see what's going on in Jerusalem. And then they would go home, and they were gone. And that's the way it kind of worked. But the key word here is this safe convoyance. Now, we use this because during the Middle Ages, all people were allowed safe convoy. And that meant you could travel freely without being robbed or harassed or mugged, let's say. What happened is some Christians began to be traveling to Jerusalem, and the Islamic members of the Islamic army or military, we might call them, began to harass them, rob them, take their goods, charge them high numbers of taxes. And that's when the king of the Byzantine Empire gets a little worried. So we've got problems occurring over in Jerusalem, but he sees this massive Muslim army beginning to take shape, and he's pretty afraid that he's going to lose his empire. So what does he do?
He calls.
We talked a lot.
He calls for the Crusades. He calls for help from the western side of Europe, and that's what kind of kickstarts this and gets us started. I do want to mention that when Mr. Holman had said that the Byzantine Empire, so the Byzantine Empire is the area here, or I suppose the area here that is to kind of reference back to the split of the Roman Empire. When it split in half, the eastern part, it becomes the Byzantine Empire.
Right, like modern day Turkey is where we're talking about. Modern day Turkey, Constantinople, Istanbul, depending on how you say it.
Correct. All right, you ready for the next one?
Sure.
All right. So Pope Urban II on November 27th, 1095, calls for the Crusades. And we're going to go to I'm going to go to the next slide here in a second, and we're going to read an excerpt of what he was, of his speech. And yeah.
Well, I will say one thing. Crusade is a religious war. That's what the word crusade means. Typically is referred to as a religious war. And you're going to notice this is obviously Pope Urban is the guy in the blue. This is him giving the speech we're going to talk about in a second. But these images with the red crosses on them that you see on them, typically people on crusade would paint red crosses on their coat of arms or on their clothing. But somehow they would represent that they are on a crusade for Christ, I think is the way we need to kind of think of this. This is about religion. This is not about just war. It's about religion. Now, there's a lot of power involved here in politics and money as well. But many of the common people that go on crusade are doing this for religious purposes. That's not always the truth with the more powerful people.
Yeah, the religion becomes almost the justification for going to war.
Yeah.
So you can think of it as so a pilgrimage, being the holy trip and so forth. You can think of a crusade as kind of like a pilgrimage, except a violent one, and with the idea of conquering and the idea of going to war. So, all right, you ready?
Yep.
All right. So, on November 27th, 1095, Pope Urban says, "For your brethren who live in the East are in urgent need of your help, and you must hasten to give them the aid which has often been promised them. For as the most of you have heard, the Turks and Arabs have attacked them and have conquered the territory. They have occupied more and more of the lands of those Christians and have overcome them in 7 battles. They have killed and captured many and have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. If you permit them to continue thus for a while with impurity, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by them. On this account, I, or rather the Lord, beseech you as Christ's heralds to publish this everywhere and to persuade all people of whatever rank, whether foot soldier, knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians and to destroy that vile race from the lands of our friends. I say this to those who are present. It meant also for those who are absent, wherever Christ commands it." Dus Volt.
Deus Volt. That would be Deus Volt. This would all be in Latin. That's why it's choppy and hard to read. Well, I kind of highlighted a couple things, and we'll talk about a couple main points here. First, that brethren who live to the east. He's talking about our friends. Those are people that are Christians that live in the east. So he sees them being in trouble, right? That's kind of the first one. That's why he says we need to give them aid. So we need to help them. Why do we need to help them? Well, because the Turks and the Arabs, which are the Muslim people at the time, have attacked them and are conquering the land. I tried to write taking land. They're taking their lands away. So he then goes on to say, they're going to continue to take our lands if we don't stop them. The next part, they have killed and captured many and have destroyed the churches. So now he's bringing in this idea that they're destroying not just our land, but they're destroying our religion. They're attacking our God. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that's what the Pope is saying, right? And they want to devastate the empire of God. He then goes on to make the emotional appeal that if you continue to do this, what's going to happen? What will happen to the faithful of God? There'll be no one left. What I find maybe the most interesting in the whole thing is the next phrase. On this account, I, or rather the Lord. What do you think he means there?
So this is the idea of the divine right, where he speaks for, or he is the spokesperson or the voice of the Lord here on earth. What I find that extremely interesting. I also find it extremely interesting that he's requesting that everybody go, whether you are a foot soldier, a knight, a poor individual, a peasant, a king, a lord, and whatever. He's requesting all people help as God is asking them to do so, as the spokesperson here on earth, as God is, as he's portraying.
Right. So and again, you pointed out that very important point. This is the first time peasants have been said, hey, you should maybe leave the manor and go do something bigger than just than work in the fields. Maybe you should leave and go on crusade. That's important. But the more you look at this, these are his words. So we're only trying to interpret what he said. But again, you kind of get that feel. He sets up the stage. We have friends. They're in trouble. We need to help them. God wants you to do this. Everybody should join me. It's God's will. That's basically where we're at right now, right?
That's right.
All right, let's move on. And this maybe becomes the more important part of his speech.
Because this is what the people remember.
Right. And this is the point that everyone tends to remember. Even to this day, this is kind of, people will remember this part of what he said. By the way, his speech that he gave for this, if I'm not incorrect, was something like 2.5 hours. So we're looking at a very, very small clip of that speech. There's no record of it other than written records. And by the way, you can find other interpretations of what he said. So this is not the end all be all. It was in Latin. There were multiple people who tried to write down what he said, but this is the gist of what he said.
Right.
You can read this one again. You're good at reading.
Okay. So, and then the point everyone remembers, all who die, by the way, whether by land or by sea or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. This I grant them through the power of God with which I am invested. Oh, what a disgrace if such a despised and base race which worships demons should conquer a people which has the faith of... Ooh, help me with that one.
Omnipotent
God, and is made glorious with the name of Christ. So, he's saying, what is he saying here?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. He says, look, if you die on the way there, if you die in the battle, and by the way, pagans, he's referring to the Muslims. He's calling them pagans, that they worship multiple gods. So he doesn't see them as equal to the Christians. Again, they are monotheistic people, just like Christians are and Judaism is. So that's not really exactly right. But that's what the Pope says. They shall have immediate remission of sins. That is the key phrase. If you die, then you get a free ticket to heaven. That is powerful. I'm a peasant. I've sinned. I have bad things in life. But the Pope's telling me that if I go there and I die, I'm going to get this free ticket. Oops, I'm moving something else. Sorry. I'm going to get this free ticket, and I'm going to be able to get into heaven. That is pretty powerful. So people look at that, they listen to it, and they are thinking of the eternal life now. And that hope that we've talked about throughout the year, about the hope that many European people believe, are now beginning to say, hey, this is pretty cool. Again, I can't say it enough that there were other people who are going on crusade to become rich, to take land away from others, for greed, for their own personal purposes. But the majority of people, fame. They wanted a new name. They wanted to get a title, whatever it may be. But the majority of the people were going because the Pope asked them to. So I think it's important to make sure we get that not everybody is out there doing this just for God. A lot of them are doing it for their own personal reasons.
Right, absolutely. All right, so we're at about 13, a little about 13 minutes here, so we
We'll go
can.
pretty quick. So you want me to just run through this slide real quick? This is stuff you're going to have to, you're going to learn about, but there were basically the First Crusade. I will tell you this, that we're only going to look at 2 crusades. We're going to look at the First Crusade and the Third Crusade. There were multiple crusades. Some books say 8, some say 12. You know, we don't really know exactly, but we know we've got the first one and the fourth one we're going to look at. So in the First Crusade, when the Pope made that call, approximately 80,000 men took off on a journey to the Holy Land. On the map, you see that they left from France and they end up in the Holy Land. That's I think that says 2,352 miles, that blue line. That is a lot of walking. That's from New York almost to LA. It took them approximately 2 years to do that. I want you to think about the travel. They're traveling over the Swiss Alps. They're traveling through deserts. How do you carry enough food for 80,000 people on caravan? You don't. So the one reason that there's the little sticker here, this one, you know, we'd be remiss to say if these guys were nice. They weren't always nice. As they passed through many villages in Europe, they would literally pillage and plunder the land just like the Vikings. They would destroy towns. They would kill the people. They would take their food. They would take their animals. They weren't really being the most Christian, I guess we'll say, but they were out, they had to survive. So that's what they did. The desert
and some of them
really
bad. For, you know, a few of them, it was justified. It was okay because they were on this crusade from the Pope, and you know, like Holmes said a minute ago, there's also people who are doing it because of maybe not being so nice, and they want fame and they want riches, and you know therefore they don't really care what they destroy on the way there. But there are also people who are on the religious side of believing that they're doing what they're supposed to from God and are still committing the same kind of acts along the way.
Yeah. I mean, to make a long story short, they eventually reached the Holy Land in 2 years. After 2 years of fighting, they lay siege to the city of Jerusalem, and eventually they gain control of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem becomes a Christian kingdom. There's a new king crowned. His name is King Joffrey. And he becomes the king of Jerusalem, and it is now Christian. So this area gets taken over by the Christians, and they build castles and they make feudalism, and life is Christian there for 80 years. And then the next phase of the Crusades starts. And with time, we're going to just move on. We'll go quickly through the next couple slides. This is what they're going to learn anyway. So what happened? After 80 years, all of a sudden, the Christians don't allow the Muslims to visit the Holy Land.
So the roles have reversed.
That's what?
The roles have reversed.
Yeah, now all of a sudden, after Christians couldn't come and the Muslims attacked them and did it, now all of a sudden the Christians do it. So the Muslims retaliate, and this time they take control of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is now in the hands of the Muslim Empire. I will also say it never regains control by the Christians ever. So we'll just keep that in mind. So the Christians are one and done with the Crusades. So here's what happens. Now the new Pope calls a second crusade. I'm not going to go into the details here other than to say that they get slaughtered in Damascus before they ever get to Jerusalem. It's embarrassing. Basically, everything goes bad. Saladin, who was the sultan or a king of one of the Muslim empires, you got little black lines here. He unites all the black lines together. Now, this is a side note. Saladin was the first one to really, it's typically traced back, the word assassin is traced back to Saladin and what happened here. He sent trained assassins to each village or each kingdom and to kill them, and then he united them under one leadership. If you ever played Assassin's Creed, it actually is referencing all this stuff. So the Muslims still control the Holy Land, and the Christians never regain control. They still control a couple areas up by Antioch and Tripoli, but we're going to move on there.
All right. And then the Third Crusade is we've got a couple of different routes that people took, and I guess is, you know, the one route is by sea, which you see by the dotted line. The other route was through land that we had kind of talked about earlier.
Yeah, so King Richard is the English king who goes by sea. So King Richard's the famous by sea.
And, you know, we need to kind of think about what that trip was like. You know, Mr. Holman and I were talking yesterday, and we were talking about how gross and dirty that those boats and stuff must have been. I mean, you don't have restrooms, you don't have a lot of space, you have to carry the animals with you on the boat, and just the mere crowdedness of that, it's not a pleasant journey. And it took a long time in order for them to be able to do that, in order for them to make that trip. So you're spending large amounts of times on a ship with animals on your way to this, holy land to
there's a
try
couple
to finish off.
That's 4,500 miles, so that's like double the amount of the walking. Like you said, the animals are in the same room with you. It's not a good sight. The Third Crusade is very interesting. The Christians should have won that. King Barbarossa was a poor guy in a sense. He was the king, but poor things happened to him. He had about 120,000 people with him. He basically is crossing a river somewhere in here. And as he crossed the river, he fell off his horse, hit his head, and died. And when the king died, everybody basically said, well, Crusade's over, and turned around and went home. But this epic battle between King Richard the Lionheart and Saladin is one for the ages. They respected each other. There's some great stories. In one particular battle, Saladin was watching. King Richard fell off his horse, and Saladin stopped the entire battle, brought his best military horse out, gave it to King Richard, went back up to his throne, sat down, and then started the battle again. So there's a true respect. These two actually continue to write letters to each other after the war. So they actually created a friendship through war. I guess I can't call it a friendship, but a mutual respect for each other. Interesting story, learn more about them. We're going to have to move on for time purposes. By the way, the Christians lose here. Saladin maintains control of Jerusalem. And that takes us to the most important thing of this whole chat, is what are the results of this? Okay, we got a series of wars that last almost 200 years. So what are the end results? And I guess because of the music, we're going to have to stop it there, and they'll have to find out.
Also, Mr. Davis, please call 114.